All right, we are going to kick off today, which is day 2. Welcome to. It's not. So the way today was going to work in regards to the AV is that this microphone is just for show. It's theatrical. It's in fact for recording in the camera back there. It is not going to be for the speakers. So we ask that the folks who are speaking to project, and you all then have a job to heckle anyone that is not projecting, or to sit closer if you don't feel comfortable embarrassing someone who is trying their best to impart knowledge to you. If you had the misfortune of being kidnapped or otherwise disposed yesterday afternoon and missed our introduction, I am a co-organizer of this conference. My name is Stuart Hicks, and I've co-organized this with Judith Jong, who has the distinct pleasure of moderating today's first panel, so she is sitting down and resting before today's first ceremony. Today we have 2 sessions centered around contemporary and projective speculations of concrete's use and reuse. Between time to check out the project, between that time and the, why are these notes all messed up? Between that time, session 2 and session 3, there is a bit of time for you to be able to check out a few exhibition openings and displays. The first display you've been able to see for a bit. It's the Kruk and Sexton incredible renovation of Jefferson and Henry Halls located just outside this room. It's part of what spawned this entire investigation. We invite you to check it out. It's for Jefferson and Henry Hall, which are just outside of this building here. But you also don't want to miss the exhibition opening upstairs in room 3350 of Naoto Kubota's commissioned photographs, which capture moments of incredible monumentality mixed with the fleeting, delicate human and atmospheric conditions present within this campus, located upstairs. There will be a few students who might grab you and force you upstairs to check it out after session 2. There's also be some time for you to check out and look around the campus and maybe grab some lunch during that time as well. Then we'll have session 3 talking about what we might do. It is also my distinct pleasure to introduce our first of today's session's moderator. Her name is Judith Jong. She's an architect, an urban designer, an associate professor at the UIC School of Architecture, whose work investigates the reciprocating relationships between architecture and the metropolis, particularly within spatially loose contexts. Her book, New Suburbanisms, is available from Routledge, and Young's interests in the future of the Netsch campus at UIC, combined with her role as Associate Dean of CADA from 2014 to 2022, produced a pair of exhibitions at Gallery 400, co-curated by Lorelei Stewart, and led to the university's 2019 International Design Competition for Center for the Arts at UIC, won by OMA and COO. In 2020, she won a National ACSA Creative Achievement Award for her Netsch campus work. Please join me in welcoming Judith Jong.
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks everyone for being here. My piece right now is brief. So this panel is what we are doing, which is focused on 4 current practices across building, teaching, and preservation, and the overlaps across those. So first we'll have Bob Score, who will talk about the restoration of Frank Lloyd Wright's Unity Temple. Then Martin Corleone from Sao Paulo will talk about some projects from his office, Metro Arquitectos. Julie Larson will frame a pedagogy of material practice, and then Patty Yosa from Lima, Peru will show projects from her office, Yosa Cortegana. So I want to introduce Bob Score. Bob is an architect and project manager with over 30 years of experience in historic preservation architecture. He's been with Harbo Architects since its inception in 2006, and previously worked with Gunny Harbo at McLear starting in the year 2000. He speaks regularly to various professional organizations and at conferences on preservation topics. Bob is on the board of the Association for Preservation Technology and is also a board member of the American Easement Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Bob Score.
Excellent. Thank you, Judith. Go back here a little bit. So I'm Bob Score. I'm a preservation architect. That's been my specialty for my entire career. And I've had the privilege of working on some really incredible projects across the United States over my tenure. A lot of work on Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, Mies van der Rohe, Louis Sullivan, quite a nice crowd of dead architects to hang out with. We're going to talk a little bit today about some work by Frank Lloyd Wright, not because of Mr. Wright, but because he did a lot of things in concrete, was reimagining, coming up with new ideas on how to approach concrete throughout his career, and fortunately left a lot of work for historic preservationists to ponder on in the future. These are some key works by Wright that I've been involved with. Well, actually, these are, yes. So recently, back in 2018, 8 sites by Frank Lloyd Wright were a serial nomination to the World Heritage List. Unity Temple, which we're going to talk about today, is one of those. They're all wonderful sites as you travel the country. If you go to Europe, it's hard to stumble anywhere without wandering into a World Heritage site. United States, that's a little bigger challenge, but these are really wonderful World Heritage sites that are in our backyard. I want to talk about some of the other concrete stuff I've done related to Wright, really briefly, just to give you some context. This is a Usonian house called Samara in West Lafayette, Indiana, that Wright did. Part of the project, both the exterior terraces and the interior floor are these sort of signature Wright red concrete paving and flooring material. The way that he achieved these concrete finishes was typically, it's called a dry shake hardened colored concrete. So although it's a red concrete, the concrete itself is just a standard gray concrete mixture. The pigmentation of these concretes is with a dry shake hardener. So why the concrete is still wet troweled, they shake on this coloration and it gets hand smooth troweled into the concrete. So the coloration is only in the top 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch of the finish. This is a technique of coloration of concrete that has sort of fallen out of favor. It's not very common anymore, and our challenge was doing significant repair and replacement of it. And in this region, there is nobody doing dry shake hardened concrete. So it required us to really take apart the concrete materials, figure out how it was made, also what are the techniques for placing it, and then bring in our experts to train the craftspeople who were doing this, who had never done it before, and make them so that they could be successful, which required a whole process of education, mock-ups, placement of concrete, tearing it out because they didn't do it right, and placing it again. This is the Emil Bach House here in Chicago. Probably, I believe it's this last prairie-style building in Chicago. The concrete elements here are a lot of these copings and bandings. This is a whole different set of challenges. After we did petrography testing on the concrete copings, we found out that it all had alkali silica reaction, which is basically a cancer for concrete. The alkali environment of the concrete reacts with the aggregates and it causes it to explode on a micro level, with the concrete eventually falling apart. The only real cure is to keep the concrete from being wet or exposed to the air, which isn't really practical. So we worked here also with teams of petrographers to come up with replacement mixes for the facing of these elements, remove the finished facing, and then do new facing that match the original to try to mitigate water intrusion. Roby House, another material that doesn't really get used anymore. The interior floors at Roby House are magnesite, which is a magnesium-based concrete as opposed to a Portland cement-based concrete. was mixed with organic materials such as wood shavings for acoustic properties. Wright used it a lot. Really beautiful material. The only place it's still used in the United States is out in California, really, and the West Coast, and there even on a minimal basis. All of the magnesite was ripped out of Roby House due to it containing asbestos long before we were involved in the house, and the challenge was to put it back. Similar to the dry shaked hardened concrete, we worked with petrographers, developed recreation mixes accurately for new magnesite, and then had to do our own experiments on how to place it, and then train the concrete tradespeople on how to place it. And then once again, after it was done, selectively come up with methods to fix what didn't work. So I think you'll see a theme that as hard as you try, with this historic work, you need to plan on doing it maybe a couple times on the same project. That brings us to Unity Temple. Constructed by Wright in 1909. You could argue one of the earliest or first brutalist buildings, if you would like to go that far, but really a beautiful masterwork. Wright considered it his jewel box. And so I want to talk a bit about what goes into these restoration projects, and this is sort of the steps. There's historic research, figuring out what it is and how it was built. There's doing condition assessments, what's wrong with it now and why. There's taking samples and working with cartographers and material scientists to really take it apart on a micro level to figure out what are all the pieces and parts and mix ratios and types of aggregates that make up these concrete buildings. There's sourcing materials. So if you're going to do exposed concrete restoration, you really need to accurately match all the original pieces of the material. And if you get the right recipe, then you get better results. And if you don't, then you see more contemporary concrete repair projects where people come back and coat their buildings with paint or Modak afterwards because they don't want to do the homework to match the concrete material very accurately. But that means you have to go, where can I find all these original stones and sands and other materials that make up the concrete? You have to go find the right stuff. There's cleaning trials, because if you try to match the concrete without cleaning it, then you match something that's dirty and it won't work in the long run. Then samples and mock-ups and trials, doing the construction, and then fixing whatever didn't work out right, which means doing it again. I'm not going to go in great detail, but these are all the players that were involved in Unity Temple. It's a long list of consultants and team members and specialty contractors. These projects are complicated and they take a lot of effort and a long time. Really quick facts on Unity Temple: designed in 1905, constructed by 1908. It's a World Heritage Site, National Historic Landmark, State of Illinois Landmark, Village of Oak Park Landmark. There were a lot of people overseeing our work and a lot of scrutiny to all the steps along the process. And there's a very complicated ownership. There was the congregation, there was a separate group responsible for restoring the building, there was the funders, which included Alphawood, who's a sponsor here today, as well as regulatory oversight, including easement holders, the Village of Oak Park. Here's a nice early rendering. I will make a quick note. Wright originally designed Unity Temple to be a brick masonry building, and they couldn't afford that, so they switched it to a concrete design. So he chose concrete because they couldn't afford brick. And then when he started building concrete, he modified his concrete materials to make them as least expensive as possible. Just a quick plan. The building's basically three parts. On your left is the sanctuary, the temple. In the middle is the entry foyer. And on the right is Unity House, which is sort of the social congregation after religious services. And it's pretty typical layout for Unitarian church. Quick construction chronology, as I mentioned, it was built in 1905, 1909 it's dedicated. Starting in 1910 through 1950s, there are multiple roof repairs due to leaks. This building was, after its first winter, was starting to have significant spalls due to freeze-thaw. The roofs leaked since the first day it was built. The heating system was not adequate when it was built and had problems from there out, which affected drying out the exterior walls. In the 60s, there was some miscellaneous modifications. And then the 70s was really what saved the building, whether you like it or not. Because of the deteriorated condition of Wright's concrete and what it was, there was a decision to basically chisel off the exterior inch of the original concrete and apply a inch-ish thick layer of shotcrete. And they did, in the 70s, for what they were doing, they actually did a very nice job. They did do analysis of the original aggregate. They did a good job of matching the aggregate. They actually used a significant amount of cement paste matrix this time, so that would be more watertight. So there was details that were lost, but it also allowed this building to still be standing. It would not have been, in my opinion, if that was not done. In the 80s, there was other miscellaneous stuff. When I got involved, which was early 2000, a couple things had started happening. The exterior cantilevers were starting to have failure. Some engineers did studies and said they should just chop all of the cantilevers off the building. It's in writing. We were also starting to get spalls on the inside. The roof ducts were starting to have spalls of concrete and dropping concrete and plaster into the sanctuary, which led to doing immediate stabilization of basically screwing plywood into all of the ceilings around the inside of the temple and then painting them so you couldn't quite tell what we did to buy time. And then we started doing extensive research and studies as to what was going on with the building. Here's some pictures under construction. This is what it looked like when it was completed. You can see that the appearance of the concrete was really dynamic. There was board form marks on it, a lot of textural inconsistency. It was really gorgeous. This is the 1950s. This is what it's looking like condition-wise. There's huge cracks, there's lots of spalls, exterior fascias are falling off, the building's really under distress. This is the building, why the shotcrete project's being done. So you can see this element in the foreground. That's shotcrete that's applied that's troweled smooth, but has not been abrasively blasted yet to expose the aggregate. But you can also see in the upper portion the condition of the copings. They're pretty much gone. And along with this, all the roofing also was a mess because the roof attaches to this concrete. So if the copings are like that, then there is nothing to attach the roofing membranes to, which is part of why this building leaked from day one. Here's some shots from '73 of them actually doing the shotcrete work. And the project after it was completed in '74. The big things you lost is that the concrete facing was much more consistent than it was when it was originally built. It did not have this huge open Rice Krispie-like texture, Rice Krispie treat-like texture. And it lost its board form designations or telegraphs. These are really the only original concrete elements left are these decorative columns between the clear story windows. Those did not get touched during the 70s restoration, and part of the reason is that these elements were the only elements that were precast. So these were laid up as precast elements. They had better integrity to the concrete, and then were installed as elements, whereas everything else was formed in place. So these still remain today. That's the only place you can know what the concrete looked like in 1908. We have some decent details of those columns, how they were built, as well as original construction photos. And then we get to where we started in 2014 with the actual physical restoration work. We're right back to where we were in 1950. Lots of cracks, lots of spalls, delaminated concrete, shotcrete deterioration, cracks forming at changes of plane. The roofs are all leaking, mainly because the substrate that they're attached to. In '70, they did the concrete right, but they did not do the substrates at the back sides of the coping, so it was all still a mismatch of construction. And so the roof termination still never worked after 1970. I mentioned we have spalled, delaminated concrete on the interior. This is right at the pulpit of the temple. where they lost a section a couple feet in diameter. Fortunately, no one was in the building when it fell off. More details of that. This is above the organ loft. All of this just came off one night. And this is related to water leakage, freeze thaw, corrosion of rebar. And to fix the roof leaks, we really got into, there's two different stories here. There's the exterior wall concrete and there's the structural concrete. The structural concrete has a lot of reinforcing in it, most of the time enough. But because the roofs were never had much integrity, there's been continuous water leakage, so we ended up doing both chipping out the top side for damage from that side. We'd also get freeze thaw from the underside of the slab, so we'd be chipping out of concrete from the undersides, as well as full deck replacements where we'd have to form and pour in new sections of deck. This is the plywood that we put up so that things would stop falling on people's heads. This went in 2009 and stayed that way until 2015. So a 6-year temporary repair. Some of the interior damage from this, which is all related. So we get in, and first thing we do is we go home, we survey 100% exterior building. We hit everything with a hammer, note whether it's delaminated, and simple spall means it's gonna fall off, map all the cracks, understand where all the damage and deterioration is, and map it out on drawings so we can see why it's happening. In the construction process, once we get in, all those areas that are deteriorated, we actually chip out and we go back to sound material. The 70s, they went back an inch. We went back a minimum of about 2 inches. Part of it is 1970s, they did not incorporate any new reinforcing into their shotcrete repairs, and we saw a lot of the results of the damage from the next 50 years was because of that, shrinkage cracks. So we added stainless steel reinforcing into the shotcrete, which pushed us to a deeper repair. This is the reinforcing going in. Some places we have to add real reinforcing. Most of it was just stainless steel mesh. Because Wright didn't use much reinforcing in the vertical wall components of the building. The reinforcing is really in the horizontal slabs. More reinforcing. Concrete match was a big deal. We spent the first year prior to construction, the same time we were doing drawings, developing concrete mixes. We probably developed 40, 50 different trial mixes using the same different aggregate ratios, different pigments. One of the challenges with concrete is one of the components is Portland cement. Every time they batch Portland cement, it comes out a different color, which if you're trying to consistently match concrete, unless you buy all your Portland at once, you're at the whim of the plant that mixed your concrete that day, which means your patches probably don't match. But the challenge we had is in 1970, they didn't buy all the Portland cement at once. So the 1970s work had about 4 or 5 different colors of shotcrete. Not that you could tell, but when you went around the corner, if I did a patch that did both sides, it would match the east face, but not the north face. So really understanding what you're matching, and we just made all these little pieces and then held them up to where we needed them to go and said, okay, this one is mix number A, or letter A, and this is mix C, and this is mix E, so that this guy who did all the shotcrete repairs, by the way, his dad did all the shotcrete work in 1970, so that was kind of fun. He'd have a roadmap of where to go. They batch everything on site. We went to multiple countries to source aggregates and then had everything sieved to get it to different sizes and then remixed it as an aggregate recipe for the project, and that was based on the petrographic analysis and acid digestion of concrete samples. They're having a real hard time getting the right size ratios on the stone, and then the gentleman doing the work was talking to his dad who did it in the 70s. He's like, oh, there's a screen in the back of the shop. The way I did that is I just shoveled all the stones through the screen and it separated them out and it worked really good. So that's the screen. Then they spray up the aggregate, the shotcrete. Pretty straightforward. They lay it up, compact it in, trowel it. And then that cures. We put curing compounds on it to reduce any shrinkage cracks. And then once it's cured, we have to expose the aggregate. And that's done by abrasive blasting with a very aggressive Black Beauty aggregate to remove the concrete paste and expose the stone aggregate. And that's the exact same thing that was done in the 1970s. And this guy's job is to remove just enough concrete paste so that the right amount of aggregate is exposed. And this is the environment he's working in. So it takes the right guy doing this work. If you really want it to number one, put up with that, he's basically in a little moon suit, but also to get the right level of exposure. Between his fingers is the patch. And the really good ones we couldn't find. And the standard was if we could find them, he would ship them out and do them again. And he probably redid about 20% of the work. So these are patched areas. Same thing, he's pointing to the edge of his repair. But it takes a lot to get to this. This is a year's worth of trial and error, and then accepting that 20% of it you're going to get wrong and do again. This is an area they got wrong. This is the main facade right on Lake Street. The problem is that the 70s shotcrete has 2 or 3 different colors in here, and he was doing one big patch, so he'd match one area and then the other area wouldn't match, and we redid this area 3 or 4 times before we said this is as good as we're gonna get. Crack repair, there was areas where we were just doing repair of cracks. We used a urethane sealant, and then this gentleman, Tom, who was the only one who could figure out how to do what we wanted, had a bucket of crushed 1970s shotcrete and sand and other aggregates, and he'd sit there and place it all embedded into the urethane sealant until you couldn't see it, and the standard was if I could see it, then he would cut it out and do it again. And he spent probably 6 or 8 months trying to seal cracks on the building so we wouldn't see them. This is sort of where we ended up when we're all done. It turned out really beautifully. I'm going to skip over these just to note there were other very significant concrete problems on the interior structural slabs and the roof slabs. Some of it was bad original reinforcing design, and we basically had entire roof slabs drop and get disengaged. There was also a lot of areas where there were beams that were concealed that once we did plaster repairs, the original concrete placement in that formwork was full of voids and basically had very little concrete integrity, and so we had to reform those in place basically. Lots of shoring, lots of rework. This is the drop slab. The drop slabs, we just moved the roofs up. It's dealt with some water management issues and redid them in steel. They're not visible elements. So that's really, I think, where we end up.
Such beautiful work, Bob. Thank you so much. I'll get Stuart's help to change over the slide, but our second speaker is Martin Corralon. He's an architect and urban planner with a master's degree from the Faculty of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Sao Paulo. In 2000, he founded the firm Metro Arquitectos Associados, where he has developed projects of various scales and programs, such as the Pietro Maria Bardi building, which is an expansion of MASP, which I think we all know. The Ladera, I'm really sorry, I'm gonna mispronounce some things, I'm really sorry. Ladera de Burquina in Salvador, and the new Fundamental Sciences building of the Technological Institute of Aeronautics in San Jose de los Campos. Since 1994, he has collaborated frequently with architect Paulo Mendes de Rocha, who won the Pritzker Prize in 2006, with whom he has completed several large-scale projects, such as the Caida Arts Museum and Theater in Vitoria, Espirito Santo. Between 2008 and 2009, he worked at the firm Foster & Partners in London. Please join me in welcoming Martin.
Okay, morning. Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here sharing some of our projects that we made mostly in Brazil. We're showing only Brazilian projects here. And as Judith already said, we are an office that has already 25 years. And we're based in São Paulo. That's why I brought this first image to, probably you heard about this huge city in Brazil, to 20 million inhabitants, that grew really fast. This verticalization happened like from the 50s or 40s on. So it's a very new city, and it's basically a vertical city with a lot of, not that high as here, but like 20 floors, towers, and all in concrete. So this is our background. I will say that this growth, it's also relates to the infrastructural growth of Brazil during the past century, and like I would say from the 30s, 40s on. So it's also a very new construction. It was, infrastructurally speaking, very much based on concrete as well, because we didn't have also steel mills. For example, the first steel mill in Brazil was from the 40s, was given by Roosevelt in the context of the Second World War. So we didn't have any other materials than concrete, and the whole culture of concrete was developed from this development of the cities and of all the infrastructure. And from that, the architectural design learned a lot and worked together with the engineer to develop some systems and some architecture that end up having a very particular way to deal with the materials. So we are very much based on that tradition. So that's why I want to show you some of the, like very briefly and very shallow show of the very, very strong and very interesting tradition of concrete in Brazil from the mid-century on. But that probably Oscar Niemeyer is the most renowned architect. He built a lot all around Brazil. This is Brasilia. It's a palace in Brasilia. He used concrete in a very organic and very sinuous and very essential forms, mostly cladded. This one is cladded. It's a palace in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, that is cladded in marble. Or in São Paulo, he built this huge residential block, which is 1,000 apartments more or less. That's in the center of São Paulo. Just on the upper corner, on the left, there's my office right now. So there's a very nice building, concrete building from Franz Hepp, Terrazzo Italia, which used to be the tallest building in São Paulo, which is very interesting too. So also this building is going through renovations, and we are dealing a lot with these kind of issues and methodologies that Bob just showed us, because we have a lot of our heritage. It's from the mid-century, so we have mostly modern heritage, and we have to deal with concrete as a material to make the recuperations, and it's a kind of a new technology that we are mostly even more connected to recently. And also Vila Nova Artigas, this is the University of São Paulo, is the Faculty of Architecture where I studied. He was an engineer also, and he was kind of the father of what it's been called the Escola Paulista, which means the school of architecture that began with him in São Paulo. And it's a very massive concrete structure with a big void in the center that articulates all the spaces around this translucent concrete structure, which is really a school of architecture in every sense. For us who used to be there for 5 or 6 years, it was a big reference in many terms. And also Lina Bobardi is another very important reference for us, a woman, an Italian woman who made this building, among others, but this maybe is the most impressive one. In São Paulo, it's the Museum of Art, and it's a big span of 74 meters. It used to be the biggest span in concrete, a post-stressed concrete beam on, actually 4 beams, 2 on top and 2 in the middle, that hangs this huge concrete box opening this plaza, the public plaza at the level of the Avenida Paulista. And it's all of these buildings obviously are all in concrete. That's why I'm showing that. And this is kind of the the roughness of this material that was in São Paulo particularly. There was always exposed concrete, not cladded, and not like very rough formwork. Showing the, and to finish this row of references is Paulo Mendes da Rocha, who I worked with, as Judith already said, for almost 30 years. And it was also very well known for the use of concrete. And this is a museum in São Paulo, which is that is a big slab too, with a big span too. And I found funny because we, seen yesterday's presentations, you measure here the biggest structures and how tall they are, and we measure it in how wide they are, you know. This is a difference that may be interpreted in many different ways, even political ways, even like the kind of power that you're dealing with. I thought this is interesting to mention. And yeah, now I'll go to show some projects that we have been done during these years. I choose to bring the first one, is the older one that we made, that was only made in concrete, whole concrete. And the other four are like current projects that we are working right now. So we brought some images of the project and also of the construction sites, because we are very connected to this kind of technical aspects of the construction, and we really like to go to the sites and to work together with the engineers very much. And so the technical aspects are very important. And as you saw in the previous projects, structure and architecture are very much connected. When structure is ready, the building usually to be ready too. Not that many cladding or finishes or decorations. So this is kind of our school, and we work that way too. Not very consciously sometimes, but it's what happens. So the first one is an art gallery that's a funny story about that, because we started in 2004 and we built with Paulo Mendes da Rocha, the small art gallery, all in concrete. And then, like 4 or 5 years later, a big company bought the whole block and proposed to the owner to buy another plot and to rebuild the gallery. Then they can demolish that. At the time, Paulo just won the Pritzker Prize, so it was like kind of commotion. Oh, they're demolishing a Pritzker Prize. And he was like, don't worry, let's do another one, and it's fine. And then they bought a new plot, and Paulo was, I don't know what to do, and do whatever you want. And so I was like trying. At the end, I decided to copy the other project exactly exactly the same building, in the new site. But we had a bonus of area that the negotiation with the new owner gave us like a bigger plot. So I just added a block to the original one. So this is the cross section. It was a very nice, like a very thin 15 centimeters concrete planes that were like folding, and the structure is only made by that. And then you have a skylight here that allows light to enter to the main exhibition room and also to the 2 rooms of the administrative rooms. And then we added this kind of storage block. That was my contribution to the project, basically. And we connected those 2 blocks with this is the interior that I was mentioning. The light coming through, it's all in concrete. It's not that easy to hang the works there, but we managed to use the formwork holes mostly, and we just calibrated the holes in a height that we could use it as much as possible. And this is the administrative rooms with also all in concrete with the light coming from up. And then we connected with a bridge that I wanted to be in concrete too, because we wanted to make it radically concrete. It was not the easiest choice, because it would be much easier to do a steel structure there. But then to add some complexity to it, I want to make a tube, but was one side open to the city. So it was kind of a challenge, hanging this slab on this other beam. So it was a kind of a tricky structure that ends up giving this transparency in the connection. And it was quite nice project to start with in this concrete world. And then, obviously, we don't do everything in concrete. We do a lot of works in other materials, but each project demands, like a solution. Sometimes it's a hybrid solution, steel and concrete. Sometimes it's only steel. And I'm showing now 3 projects that we're doing right now, 4 projects that we're doing right now, mostly in concrete. This is completely different. Also, that's interesting because we used to work a lot with cultural institutions and art-related works, but we are an office that makes very different scale and very different programs. So not only cultural museums and art galleries, but also to the market, to the development market. We used to do like public spaces or collective use spaces. We don't do many private residences or this kind of stuff, which are very common in Brazil. Like the high-end architecture is mostly connected to these super rich houses, etc. We I don't know how, but we managed to keep working on the public realm, even if it's a private commission. It deals with a collective space, which I think it's very interesting, and the relation with the city also. So this one is a kind of a development, like a commercial development that we are doing for a big company there. So the main issue here was to keep it as cheap as possible. The profit was the main goal for everything. So we ended up proposing a concrete grid with a twist, with this kind of displacement to create some complexity to it. And we managed to do a whole frame of concrete. It's almost like a Soul-Lewitt sculpture. And then, because we wanted to do a tower, you basically mixed-use buildings are kind of lever house prototype with a plinth and a slab on top of it. In Brazil, there are many examples of that. And then the new regulations of the city allowed to build again multi-use, and we wanted to do kind of a very sharp tower that connects to the ground and goes up, and add the various programs into this whole structure that look like a tower, like an object, a solid object, not parts, not mixing parts. So the idea is to have this very regular grid and then to carve some voids on these spaces to add some complexity and to comply with the different programs. So we have some residential here, duplexes, offices here, retail here, and offices again on the top. And this is more or less the complexity of the section. And the floor plan, you have like around here in the peripheral, the structure is only the grid around and this circulation core, and a lot of different slabs that connects and create voids inside the building, allowing to many different typologies. And this is more or less how it will look like. And it's almost done. It's like at the end of the upper part. And another thing that was interesting about that is that the developer wanted to do some of the walls in a very regular concrete blocks and bricks, whatever. And the construction company, and we were like, well, we would like to have something more like as a facade, something more interesting, but it was a fight. And at the end, they won. They always won, and they do it like some very regular wall to fill these voids. And the construction company came with the suggestion to do that in concrete panels, precast concrete panels too. So this is something that we have been using a lot, mixing in situ concrete with precast panels. And it was a very clever solution because they have much less labor involved. It's super faster. They plan to do all the finishing in 5 or 6 months, and they're doing it in like almost finish it in 2.5. It's very, very practical. And it will look like more or less like that. These black parts are the concrete panels and then just a glass on top of it. Well, The other one is a private museum. It's different, completely different typology as well. There's a banker in São Paulo that bought a very nice collection, art collection from the 60s, mostly Brazilian art, modern art, like was called concrete and neo-concrete, the two movements, very important movements of art, with Hélio Oiticica, Ligia Clark, and many important artists. And he wanted to build a space to show this collection and also to hold some private events. So we ended up proposing a concrete box raised from the ground with some light coming in and from the windows. And it was a very peculiar plot. It was a kind of a triangular shape, 2 streets. And we just made a building that is a result of the setbacks, the required setbacks. And this is the shape of it's kind of a triangular building. And we structured that with 3 walls. That one, the other one, and the third one here that loads, that carry all the loads and also divide the space with the exhibition spaces to the back of house, let's say, areas and circulations here. And also these walls are all in concrete, they are like only touching the floor in 4 columns each side, so each points, and the building is heavy, but it's lifted. And we also did a double layer here with, again, concrete precast panels where you can go with all the infrastructure because we had a limit of height too. And then some slabs that connects with this kind of concrete and neo-concrete constructive art, like the angles, exploring the right angles here and giving some complexity only by using right angles, which is amazing result because we are using only right angles, but the space goes around this void, this atrium, and looks like very complex. At the same time, it's not a strange feeling because you always have a right corner. So here you can see the lifted building and the cladding on concrete panels as well. And also these pieces are like very nice to do the fencing. It's a concrete piece that we designed also. There's this kind of transparent. And more or less, this is how it is. Like last week, before I came here, I went to the site and took some pictures, and skylight and very nice openings. And this is the concept of the facade that I was talking to, like the in situ concrete, the structural one, which is thicker than the drawing is showing, and then the concrete precast panels, and then this is how it looks. It's almost finished, and this is how it's. You see the space between the floor and the building itself, and here the infrastructure going into the wall. The inside concrete is very, very nice because we worked a lot. This is a very complex in terms of engineering because it's a post-stress concrete slabs, 40 centimeters high. It's like, how do you say that? It's only concrete and it's post-stress, and the whole thing worked as a unit, a structural unit. It has to be scaffolded until the last slab was concreted, and then you take out the supports because it only works structurally when it's all completed. You cannot do like by layers. And it was a very, very interesting, like super high resistant concrete, and the formwork was kind of a polyethylene plate, very nice, and it's kind of a very, very beautiful finish. We want to lick it by almost. It's very like a velvet. It's very beautiful. It's not rough as the other images that I showed before. Also, the floor is a concrete with the aggregate. We put some black stones on as aggregates to make this, and they are like, also it's a very technological concrete because there are no, how do you say that, joints. It's a monolithic floor, like 200 square meters without any joints, so the retraction and additives, etc., to make, and fibers, etc., to make it work. And yeah, that's it. And now this is a completely different approach to concrete. Also, I'm trying to show how different can be the work and the thinking of using the concrete, because more rough, more like beams and pillars, or like planes. And this one was interesting because it's a intervention in an existing building next to MASP, the museum that I showed from Lina. And it's our kind of museum contribution to São Paulo. It's this black tower here. And this is an interesting story because the project of the tower began in 2018, but I started working at the museum in 2015 when they changed the administration, and they brought me to work with the exhibition design, which we are like very experienced too. And we started dealing with the building, not only the exhibition designs, because the building was not in a very good shape, and it was a very interesting structure, but it was like decaying. So part of the works were like to put up a plan of how to treat this concrete, similar to Bob's work. And this was first part of the work, was to deal with the existing structure, and also to reestablish some of the concepts of Lina's that deals with transparency, this contrast between the weight of the building and the lightness of the spaces, the feeling of the spaces, that is pretty much represented for this way of hanging the collection, which is an amazing collection of European art that are floating. All the works are floating, and you can see almost them at once when you enter the space. And this is based on a system that she invented as a block of concrete with a sheet of glass, and all the works are hanging on those glasses. But this was not there when we started working. The previous administration replaced it with like wooden panels, very regular and very cheap wooden panels, closing the windows and making like regular rooms in kind of European style museum. So one of the first works was to redesign this, because they had some problems, actually, technical problems, and redesigned the system, adding some standard way of hanging the works, and also putting some neoprene here to absorb the vibrations, the new vibrations by the subway and the buses that allegedly caused some vibrations on the works, with the problems for the pictorial layer. And so it was a 1 year work and technical and testing development to make this kind of 40 by 40 block, which is kind of funny because it looks exactly the same, but was a very long technical development. And from that experience working on that museum, we do new lighting. We use the system, the air conditioning system, to reverse in case of fire, to extract the smoke, and had to open some windows here to allow the fresh air to enter without noticing, because it's a listed building in 3 levels, like the city, the state, and federal. So there was a huge amount of problems to deal with heritage, safety issues, and at the end, the main goal was to recreate the original ideas of the building. And in that process, the building next to it that was already a propriety of MASP that was being donated in 2006, and they did a project there to have money for the museum, and they began to build a project, which is this massive structure that was inside an existing residential building, and the work stopped for 10 years, and when we started there, this was kind of a ruin. So it was a property of MASP, but they didn't know what to do. And so in this process, we proposed to do an extension of the museum, and it happened. So we did a building that is mostly for exhibitions. These yellow parts are 5 galleries. There are 2 multi-use spaces, some technical spaces, and and also public for the public. The new entrance of the museum will be in the new building, and it's connected to the old building by an underground passage under Avenida Paulista that connects with the Linas building right now. So this allows us to clean even more the original building and to put some services and some technical stuff that were not working in the original building, and to create a museum it's only one big structure in 2 buildings. So to do that, we had like this big structure here in the middle that was the access to this ugly part here. So we started working on how to transform this structure, and we removed the upper part and also removed the central circulation. And we removed one slab, each 2, we removed one to create double height spaces because it was originally a residential building. And with that, we had a kind of because first of all, we couldn't demolish the whole thing because we had kind of some rights on gross areas that if we demolish everything and started, we have to apply the new laws that will allow us to build like half of the area. So we have to do an intervention and to keep these rights of areas. So we use this credit of areas that we demolished to put here an extra set of floors in a regular creating a regular volume, and not only an area credit, but also a weight credit, because we couldn't work on the foundations of this building. So all this, the weight that we removed here, when we did this new area in a lighter steel structure, we get some credit on weight, and we didn't have to work on the foundations of the building. So this was more or less the operation. And then we added a new circulation that was kind of the main structural part of the building. So this is the result of the typical floor plan with the columns, existing columns here that we enveloped and created a new rigid structure here and an open space as big as possible. And the interesting thing about, 2 minutes, okay. The interesting thing about that is that instead of how to build, we have to think of how to destroy concrete. These are the drawings of how to cut the old structure in pieces to bring it down with a crane. And all the reinforcements and the construction of the new structure that happened. This happens, you know, that the old structure and the new one, and we couldn't demolish everything, and we have to deal with all those coexistence times of demolishing and building. And this is the result. And just for finishing my presentation, well, we use a lot of concrete, exposed concrete in the interiors and with post-stressed slabs, etc. And also, this is kind of a citation of the tradition that I mentioned. It's rough formwork and a very artisanal staircase that we found a guy who, it's an 85 years old guy, a Japanese guy who used to work in the 60s and made the most incredible houses. And he did artisanally, like he and 2 assistants, he did all the formwork for that by hand, like a carpenter, and it's quite beautiful. It's almost a sculpture. It's a handcrafted concrete. And just to finish, I will go faster. This is a museum, a theater that we are. It's also a funny story because we have a lot of funny stories because architecture takes so much time sometimes. And this project, I started working on it with Paulo Mendes da Rocha in 2007, and it was a commission from the governor of the state of Espírito Santo to build like a cultural complex, a museum and a theater, opera theater. And we did a project, the construction began and stopped for 10 years, and now they're finishing it, and it will be ready next year. It will be open to the public, and unfortunately Paulo died a few years ago, but it's kind of a posthumous work. And we work a lot on this project, and it's very interesting because here you see the museum, which is a long pavilion only on 6 columns, 55 meters span and 18 meters cantilever each side. And this is a theater that has some columns into the sea, into the water. This is a plaza that is open, the building is raised, and also the theater has a free passage here, so it's a kind of a public plaza, and the buildings are up. And this is the section. It's a long pavilion with some slabs inside it, and this kind of irregular shape, open shape, with the windows facing down, facing the floor. This is how it will look like, and it's a very big beam, 8 meters high, 1 meter and 80 wide, void, post-stressed with a central column. And then we hang some inverted porticos, steel porticos, to hang the other slabs. And then it's cladded, this bottom part is cladded with concrete panels, prefab concrete panels. And it's other scale. It's completely different scale. It's like more infrastructural scale. This is this column here is fixed to the foundation. This one has a kind of a bridge equipment that allows to slide because of the contraction and expansion of the concrete. And here you can see the inverted porticos that hang the slabs. And this is the theater that is also a massive structure in concrete with the columns here in the water that we had to manage to do, very similar to the Riverwalk system that we saw yesterday. And this is like last week photo of the cladding of the theater. And this is right now how it looks. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. The work is incredibly beautiful, and I'm obsessed with the private museum and the way it floats above the ground. It's really incredible. So our third speaker today is Julie Larson. She's an associate professor and chair of the graduate program at the School of Architecture at Syracuse University, with a design research focus on how architecture manifests itself as a material practice that is productively informed by computation, fabrication, and the environment. Prior to her tenure at Syracuse, Julie was a lecturer at the University of Michigan and at the ETH in Zurich under the chair of Mark Angelil, and an assistant professor at the University of Illinois. Please join me in welcoming Julie Larson.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you, Stuart. And thank you for the introduction and inviting me here today. I won't go into a great detail about my own research because you're going to actually hear from my partner, Roger Hubley, just in the next session. But I do want to maybe just shed a light a little bit on our material practice and what we're trying to accomplish and how that starts to inform the way I actually go about challenge the way we think about our grad program. So our research with concrete is very proliferate. We work together with CEMEX Global R&D. We've been working with them for over 10 years. It's very much informed a lot of the research work that we do. We're really in pursuit of pioneering design applications and how to work with cementitious materials through various scales and applications. And our research with concrete, both with industry collaborations, but also with our studios, really starts to reveal its persistent capacity to really surprise us, evolve, and even provoke. And I'm going to not go into great details, but I will say that for our own work, but we really see concrete as a pursuit, as an agent of speculation and inquiry, and it's really a way of thinking. It's an approach to how we go about our designing and experimenting and just trying to imagine what architecture can do. So it's really about, for us, using it as an opportunity to experiment and try new things and push what the material is capable of. I should have moved on to this. This is just a brief introduction of some of the work we do, where we have, and Roger's going to go into details about some of these projects that you see here. and where we're really trying to think about how the material can foster new and exciting, performative, and uniquely kind of fabricated forms, really trying to think for ourselves anyway, how to make the impossible possible, and how we can start to use that to generate maybe future kind of aspirations that you'll see later. But today, I'm here to talk about our work in my graduate program, in our graduate program at Syracuse University. And for me, as an educator and leader at our school, we're looking to see how to start to, what you see in the title, recasting post-Fermitas and the material turn. It's really based on just what we've been doing in the last maybe 3 to 5 years in the program, trying to kind of rebrand, reimagine what we are doing, and really digesting like what we are kind of bringing forth to the students. So all the images that you're going to see over the next few slides are all the student work and our study abroad visits. But for us, we've really seen it as like we're taking a new turn, a material turn, because really starting to think about speculation, imaginary, and matter, and how those start to coalesce. So speculation turns materials into sites of inquiry, as I mentioned with our own practice, and not just about tools for building. So we start with materials, the students begin to interrogate, they experiment, they prototype, they test, and they fail forward. So it's not about a kind of technical pursuit, but almost like the reverse, as a way of thinking and experimenting. It's in the kind of traditional sense. We're not necessarily kind of putting 2x4s together and seeing how to do that more efficiently, or pouring a concrete foundation, or I will say, God forbid, like just kind of applying like materials in rhino and textures of steel and concrete. But it's really about kind of following intuition and dissecting and interrogating through the lens of matter and material investigations. So using concrete, for example, is not about the status quo. And we really start to question and ask the students to question how, like a wall, whether or not it needs to be 8 inches thick. We ask students to test those limits. We embrace inconsistencies and really use it as productive inquiries for learning and invention. We encourage that invention with research, and that could be in the form of things like carbon capture or bioresponsive materials that start to react to the environment. As my colleagues Bert Eversole and my partner Roger Hubley argue in Material Constructs and the Post-Fermitas, learning design through a qualitative, intuitive investigation of matter shifts architectural pedagogy away from formal determinism and toward a practice grounded in reflection, process, and the accumulation of matter. So instead of assuming buildings will be eternal monuments, as we've started to see today, it's not so easy to imagine that there's a kind of eternalness to them. We acknowledge that architecture today often deals with that ephemeral quality, the incomplete, the adaptive, and the experimental. So this post-Fermitas challenges the Vitruvian triad of firmness, commodity, and delight by insisting that architecture is not in the imposition of ideal geometries upon inert matter, but rather the exploration of matter's own capacities, its limits, and its temporalities. So to engage in matter directly, its resistance, its openness, its imperfection, is to really cultivate judgment as not just a justification for the act, but as a reasoning embedded in how something is made. So with concrete, for example, it serves not as a default material, but as a provocateur. Its roughness, its weight, its plasticity force students to grapple with these issues of labor, ecology, embodied energy, with digital advances that allow us to start to cast and 3D print and hybridize as a way to kind of really push that experimentation. Post-Fermitas puts architecture value not just in its kind of structural permanence, but its capacity to engage, change, adapt, and use the process of making and use for their work. This material and process-based approach aligns with a kind of century-long counter-tradition that treats form not as a fixed outcome, but as something that emerges, deforms, and dissolves in the world. In this view, imperfection, deviation, erosion, weathering, or even decay are not failures in our view, but consequential aesthetic conditions and opportunities. So how can we start to use that experimentation, prototyping, and speculation to fuel a project? So prototyping is a way of experimentation for us. Most of us see in our grad program, we see it as like kind of laboratory across many avenues, from our studios to the research courses we have to the yearly graduate pavilion. So the students are testing as a form of open-ended experiment. Prototyping in this context means working with materials as active partners, really for discovery and embracing errors and unexpected results, and using those as opportunities. So following thinkers like Tim Ingold or Paul Klee, we see architecture not as a finished product, but as a material process that's always in flux. So prototyping is what we might call a kind of generative misuse. We deliberately push tools like AI, fabrication software, robotics, or casting into failure mode. We encourage students to produce results outside of the controlled outcome and mind that for access for design. And we use this way of thinking and working to shift from controlling outcomes to really curating a process instead, embracing that unpredictability as a driver for form. So by foregrounding experimentation and ambiguity and even failure, prototyping becomes a central part to how we investigate or invent new possibilities for architecture. So case in point, one of the very first images that I showed at the beginning was a complete and utter failure in one of the research courses, but that ended up being a very intriguing failure for the student and became the impetus for his entire studio project, where he was starting to look at this collapsed piece of 3D printed form as a potential for a foldable surface in his project. For example, also the students start to prototype at the scale of precast joinery in our integrated studio that Roger teaches. They use the prototype of the joint as a way to question the material. When students work with precast concrete in an integrated studio, the prototype isn't just a model, it's a point of discovery with the material. By pushing it toward extremes, cantilevers that defy gravity, panels that sway, aggregations of concrete elements so thin they read as fabric, help us to begin to see the limits where those actually lie, and how those limits can be bent to their will and reimagined. So prototyping really starts to shift the concrete from abstraction to something that's monolithic, something that's heavy, a noun, to a potential what if. And that for us is more of like a verb, a responsive kind of act, a surprising act. So they concrete is my way of seeing it. It's important because only through this kind of hands-on questioning can students start to discover how inconsistencies and failures and experimentation can become really design drivers. And from this perspective, it really becomes a foundation for a lot of our kind of way of kind of bringing a kind of contemporary pedagogy to the program. Students are encouraged to dwell in that imperfection and start to think about how we now can operate within a landscape that's maybe actually kind of embracing things like AI and robotics and computational ideas as well. That convergence really, for me anyway, sees a kind of extension of what Eversole and Hubley's argument was, where we're training our students to learn how to think with matter, but also with machines. So it's going on, I think it's unavoidable that we are kind of working from digital fabrication maybe into AI and what we can start to do with that. So for us, it's really about how we see our program creating new pedagogical systems of inquiry rather than operating in existing ones. So how can the machine, for me and for our program, become that collaborator? So every generation of architects has been defined by its tools, from Vitruvius's compass to Brunelleschi's perspective machine, from drafting tables to CAD, from parametric modeling to robotic fabrication. We kind of work from Maya to 3ds Max to Python to Ladybug, it goes on. And now we have AI, and tools have always kind of shaped what architects can imagine and what we can do with those tools. So we extend this process by integrating something like fabrication or AI or machine learning, not as shortcuts. We see it really much more like a collaborator. Our students learn to think simultaneously with matter and machines as much as they are interested in using them, and developing research capacities that are responsive to what they're trying to accomplish in the project. Our program embraces this lineage by kind of nudging things forward. We see tools and equipment as merely just instruments of, not merely as instruments of efficiency, but as agents of speculation. So a robotic arm is not just a faster, more efficient mason, it's a collaborator that can execute patterns of assembly beyond human capacity. A laser cutter is not just a representational method or tool for us, it's a device that becomes a way of engaging in a particular idea. The 3D printer is not just a scaled model, it's used to really kind of print kind of prototype elements, structural components, or think about building assembly in a new way. So by cultivating this fluency across both analog, craft, and advanced fabrication, students learn to think critically about how making really starts to shape meaning. They recognize that tools are not neutral. They can carry cultural, economic, and ecological consequence to master that agency. So how do students start to find that agency in the process? How can this fluency across analog and advanced fabrication be a true form of invention? So matter as invention. At its core, I believe that architecture is a material discipline. No matter how advanced our software really becomes, buildings are still made of matter, of concrete, wood, steel, glass, brick, and anything all the way up to new and exciting materials like biomaterials and recycled waste streams. So we really see materiality as a way to engage in a process of making and how it can transform the human and non-human experience. But for our program, materiality, or more importantly, matter, is not about just learning how to specify standard assemblies. It means treating matter as a site of inquiry and speculation. Concrete as matter acts as both a constraint and an invitation. How do we minimize its carbon footprint, invent porosities to allow for water and plant life, or repurpose industrial byproducts, or program new material behaviors with admixtures and fibers? So concrete is not just a neutral substance for us poured into a formwork. It is a centrial material that continues to evolve, capable of 3D printing, bending and folding, and new forms of hybridization. We see this evidently at many scales in the program, from our first studios inquiring about how to start to engage salt as a form of matter, and how to start to think more infrastructurally with that salt and other materials through the process of building and making, to the second studio, where there's really a kind of push for kind of new and interesting biomaterials like mycelium, hempcrete, and biolith that really become a form of investigation for wall construction. In the second year studio, the kind of main matter is water, but how that water starts to kind of work together with other materials like concrete to start to really think about a material presence as we deal with rising sea levels along the coast. So research courses and studios alike, they're all kind of working towards this idea of really translating kind of how the material and the way of kind of approaching the project starts to be informed by these material effects. To lastly, the integrated studio with the study abroad component to Switzerland, which Roger's been doing the last few years, was really meant to offer students the opportunity to see how cultural meaning plays a significant role in how it influences design and construction. So these last few years, he's been taking students to Switzerland, focusing the project and the studio on precast concrete, which you'll see a little bit more at the end here. And by traveling to their site and visiting concrete and precast manufacturers, the course situates itself squarely in the flow between material science, architectural experimentation, and real-world application. That not only challenges students to question concrete's ability to perform in unprecedented and emergent ways, to bend and torque it at will, take a study abroad trip to Switzerland to really start to learn about precast concrete through meetings and demonstrations with concrete manufacturers and material scientists. That was Lauren pushing her way through one of those right there. And then it brings me to making is not a secondary act of representation, but a primary mode of research. Through digital fabrication and hands-on prototyping, students can test their ideas in real time. For example, the discourse within the first year studio rejects static understandings of form in favor of cyclical, dynamical processes of making, aimed at learning from matter and materiality, rather than simply imposing form on material and accepting what the standardized world of material economies foist on us. Or in the second year studio, we highlight how the built environment is not a passive container, but an active agent in shaping urban and spatial experience. The studio provides students with a framework and methodology to explore architectural design research with a multiplicity of interpretations, contradictions, and intellectual kind of pursuits in response to climate change and dealing with different kinds of materials in response to that. Also in the integrated studio, as you see here, where concrete is the primary material, as I mentioned, emphasizes precast concrete and how it informs the structural and environmental systems that are often understood as utilitarian consequence of architectural production. So speculative design for an assembly is not simply modeled in Rhino, it's crafted. The work in the studios reveal how joints align, how tolerance shift, or how materials behave under stress in response to external forces. That could be wind patterns, that could be climate resistance, vegetation, salt spray, even decay. And in the iterative loop, design, fabricate, test, refine, the prototype, builds a culture where failure is productive, where discovery happens through that stubborn reality of matter and the environment, and that it imposes itself on that matter. So in doing so, the students really develop both craft and literacy and technical agility at the same time. They understand that precision is not only digital but also physical, and that there is a tolerance to what they make, and that the architect's role is to bridge that divide. So in this way, making is more than just form finding. It is a form of inquiry and lets students test how architecture negotiates and produces dynamic systems of environment, infrastructure, and culture, discovering new potentials and responsibilities along the way. Now, the emergence of artificial intelligence has already reshaped countless industries. In architecture, it is tempting to see how AI is either a threat, an engine that automates creative labor, or a shortcut for image production. There was significant resistance by our students and our faculty at SU with AI. But within our program, we took a different kind of position. We saw AI as neither a savior nor a villain, but a design partner and that really can start to challenge and demand maybe a different kind of engagement. So I at the time, a couple years ago, dedicated an entire year to discuss this. We used our design research workshops that we do every year. It's always a series with a theme. I used that to start to talk about the aesthetic agenda of AI at the time, where we really questioned the role of AI and the impact of it in the program, but also on the profession. So I invited guests like Matias Del Campo, Sandra Manager, Corey Beige, and others. And we asked, how can AI augment the speculative exploration of materiality and aesthetics? How can it generate new possibilities of form, structure, and material? For instance, AI can be trained on databases of material behavior, predicting how a new composite might perform under load. It can simulate environmental outcomes at massive scales and allow for designers to really weigh performance and cost and ecological impact. But it can also produce hybrids of materials and geometries that human intuition might not have considered. So how do students learn to guide those algorithms, not by being replaced by them, but really owning them? So where post-Fermitas for me comes into this is that we really challenge students to prompt AI models, not just for formal novelty, but for emergent material behavior. We're training maybe algorithms in Blender to simulate creep, cracking, curing, patina of materials in the program. And I think you probably are wondering why or how AI starts to really kind of fold into a conference on concrete. But I very much appreciate, probably because of my background in concrete, I appreciate how what AI is to like language, that concrete is to form. They're both systems designed for uniformity that really we really value them for that kind of inconsistency, that messiness and unpredictable quality that they both have. And similar to how concrete's beauty lies partly in its refusal to be perfectly controlled, AI, especially when hybridized, reveals misalignments and awkward things. Things start to kind of happen that you don't plan on, you don't expect. And those flaws are very much, I think, exciting opportunities for students, not too dissimilar to when we make mistakes or things happen with concrete too. So designers often use those irregularities, the glitches, the juxtapositions as a way of pushing beyond the kind of polished output. And I just want to briefly show this. This is something that just my students sent to me. I couldn't put it into the original presentation, but it's my students, my current grad students, they're being encouraged to try ChatGPT and just make scripts even though they've never done it before. So they're using things like Claude or Perplexity and using really the program as a tool. So in these early attempts, they actually were looking at concrete tetrapods and X-blocks, their infrastructural elements for breakwaters that they are using in their landscape, but they're thinking about how to start to translate that to dynamic inflatable surfaces as well, and starting to look at the kind of textures and materiality that come from that. thinking about the kind of architecture becoming an active registration of that redirected water that they're trying to slow down, and how it can be released over time. It was just kind of a funny thing that they sent me, and I was glad to show it today. So just to finish, in a time of ecological crisis, rapid technological change, and cultural unpredictability, architecture itself must be recast to expand that field, our field, into productive ways. This classical kind of idea of Fermitas, of solidity, of permanence, gives way to post-Fermitas conditions that are more dynamic, adaptive, and uncertain, not dissimilar to our future environment, probably. So in this context, materials, especially concrete, can no longer be static matter, but agents of transformation. Materials of what we do with them must be dynamic, they must be speculative, experimental, and courageous. To recast material practice is to expand the field, to rethink the discipline's foundations, and to see a material like concrete not as an inert substance, but as a living site of imagination, speculation, and cultural value. We aim to have our graduates not merely draw details, but hypothesize new material ecologies. In this way, our program positions materiality making AI not as tools, but as collaborative provocateurs, agents in a continually evolving culture. The material turn as an educational ethos for us is where material intelligence becomes cultural intelligence. The outcome is uncertain by design, because a truly experimental field must remain unfinished. What comes next is unknown, but that uncertainty is precisely where invention begins. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie, for that provocation. So our fourth speaker this morning is Patricia Llosa, who is an architect graduated from Ricardo Palma University with a master's degree in criticism and project from the Polytechnic University of Catalonia. She co-founded, together with Rodolfo Cortegana, the practice Llosa Cortegana Arquitectos in 2005. The studio explores and situates architecture in a circumstantial state, opening possibilities for knowledge from uncertain spaces, incorporating what lies beyond architecture into the process of thinking about the discipline. Each project thus becomes an opportunity to shape people's realities through subjectivity, territorial and climatic conditions, history, cultural expressions, and the discipline itself. Please join me in welcoming Patty Llosa.
First of all, thank you, Stuart and Judith, for this invitation. I'm very glad to be here and to share what we're doing in my part of the world. I will try to share with you today the work that we have been doing with Rodolfo, my partner, since 2005, framing it in a broader context and trying to establish continuities with our territory, our culture, and our constructive tradition. And please forgive my English. We live and work in Peru, a territory that has been shaped by architecture for thousands of years. Our desert coast has been inhabited by cultures that, even before the Incas, built imposing earthen structures that survive to these days. That understood the seismic condition of our territory, handling the scale and thickness of their walls and their great platforms. Our ancestral construction tradition in rammed earth contributed to model our landscape and remains in use until now in different regions of our country. In the city of Lima, we still live side by side with more than 370 adobe huacas, pre-Hispanic earth structures that have been gradually surrounded by the city growth, leaving them completely interwoven with the current urban fabric. To practice architecture in this context places us as part of a greater order of things into an architectural genealogy. The projects that we have been working on seek to establish these continuities, informing our projects with the discoveries of those who came before us, incorporating the material culture we possess, yet articulated through a contemporary grammar in dialogue with the past. To this end, we have been formulating certain ideas that frame our design reflection. we are interested in thinking of architecture as a text, in dialogue with Eisman, because we understand that the reflection on a building does not end with its construction. Rather, it is possible to continue reading and extracting new ideas from them. By reading the buildings that came before us, we can decipher their architectural values from a personal perspective. In doing so, we are able to reinterpret from the present what was once conceived in an open way. If architecture is a text, it is inevitably open to interpretation. We are not neutral. We read and interpret architecture from the here and now, and we try to do so free from imposed external values and structures of power. For us, representation is a medium through which we read and interpret architectural interests. It is through the freedom of drawing that we can reveal new imageries for ongoing design. Representation and the abstraction it enables allow us to extract knowledge from the buildings that we investigate through our readings. Findings that open alternative paths for new projects while remaining rooted in a tradition that precedes us. Imageries of profiles, platforms, and layers emerging from pre-Hispanic buildings such as this San Juan de Pariachi, or those that arise from reading the buildings of Peru's important modern concrete tradition, such as the works of Miguel Rodrigo Mazuré, or the Ministry of Culture from Cruchaga, Soller, and Rodrigo, or those from Arana Orrego Torres, just to mention some or a few. We decode the ideas and decisions made by the architects in the past that most times remained hidden at the moment the buildings were completed. Through open representations, we are able to reveal those ideas as findings that allow us in some way to transform the future of the past. Finally, our concern lies with the question of matter, especially as it is inscribed within a broader tradition. We are interested also in prefabrication processes, mostly inside, from those that handcrafted as these adobe blocks that relate very naturally to the concrete structures, for example, in this house in Chincha, or those fabricated in concrete blocks that configure lattices with variations according to their orientation or visuals that build the surface of this project in Paracas Bay. We are also confronted with material explorations in different scales, as in this project where we designed a series of 3-meter-high lattice precast pieces to control the entry of the sun into the classroom areas of this elementary school in Lima, which are at the same time the elements that define its elevation. But perhaps where we explore the most is in relation to hollowed and compacted material. We have experimented with adobe rammed earth walls that allows large wall thicknesses in this house, for example, in the desert of Ica, but clearly it is reinforced concrete with handcrafted wooden formwork, the material we work the most often. Not only because it expresses its nakedness and the imprint of its own building process, both inside and outside, taking advantage of our moderate climate throughout the year, but also because of its seismic condition, because of the seismic condition of our country, where concrete is the most used structural system. In this sense, it is for us a relevant and sustainable material in a region where the effort involved in constructing a building must make it last over time and must need as little as maintenance as possible. I will now briefly share 5 projects, all built in concrete, which I believe help to understand the flexibility, malleability, and expression that is so important for us of this material. The first one is the Oliver Pavilion, which is not a house, but a building that increases the experience of a house. The project was an extension to a pre-existing building by architect Emilio Soller in a large lot in the middle of an old olive grove. This was an opportunity to reflect on architectural lineages, reading the previous house, with a series of drawings to establish possible dialogues with Soller's work, and configure a series of new architectural imageries that define the spatial roof which configures the new building's elevation. Expressing its bare material in a long fragmented volume besides the existing house. The spatial roof is affected by those readings of the previous house, in dialogue with those of the new project, such as this one. The cuts and perforations shape the interiors, and the plasticity of concrete amplifies the experience, both vertically and horizontally. The building houses spatial variations, such as the wide curvature of this living space, or the planes and voids that segments its continuity, where the light emphasizes the footprint of the formwork, and the shadow of the repeated beams manifest their presence. This house is articulated from a long axis of circulations that extends parallel to the entire building and confronts the staircase with a long ramp that slows down the way to the introspective lower level, where an excavated space with a swimming pool appears between large structural spans. This is not a house, paraphrasing Magritte. This pavilion proposes a series of new uses and dynamics, allowing us to create new encounter spaces in close connection with the exterior, pushing the concrete structure to its limits in a seismical place like ours, seeking a frank integration with the landscape and diluting its limits. The second project is a house in Paracas Bay. On a 90-meter-long lot, our clients requested to occupy the entire length. So we proposed a sequence of interweaved rooms and patios, organized by a long walkway along the lot. The reinforced concrete structure that covers it articulates the entire house, seeking horizontal connection with the landscaping, integrating fragmented volumes that combine different concrete techniques, such as beams, cast slabs, prefabricated blocks, and concrete lattices that surround the patios, configuring different layers and veils to control the view. The exposed concrete beams and pillars become elements that, in their repetition, set up a spatial sequence in the house, defining its expression towards the bay. These elements resonate with the factory imagery that the owners had from their childhood's memory. So these light filtering elements that direct the gaze to the sky and project their shadows in the spatial threshold frame now the family encounter dynamics, directing their view to the horizon. The next project is the CIA Library in the Catholic University in Lima, where we teach, located in a context with adobe buildings of ancient Peru, such as Huaca Larga and Huaca Tres Palos that we see in that photograph. Circumstances that generated the project and its definition of materiality and color, as well as the tensions and connections of the campus, its community, and their surroundings. Situations that enable us to shape the building's figure. Its placement is defined by a topographic section that generates continuity with the public space of the campus, where we appreciate the texture of this natural red pigmented concrete, and the relationship with the campus green and the new created topography. The volume is shaped through cutouts that reveal the main staircase, defining the building's character as the finishing touch of the large pedestrian circulation road of the university campus. This drawing allows us to see how the floor plan is freed to displace the architectural inquiry to the main staircase, leaving an open and flexible floor. This staircase is probably the most relevant space for us in the building, to reinforce the experience of displacement within it. Its central bay channels the entry of light from the zenith, and the other two expand and connect with the rest of the spaces by bridges in different levels. The naked material is expressed at both inside and outside, as we in Lima do not have the need of thermal layers in our buildings because of our constant moderate weather. And the upper threshold, made of the same material, filters the light into this vertical space, further dramatizing the experience, and in a way, confronting us with our human condition. The next project is probably the most important one for us, the Pachacamac Museum. Located in the sanctuary of Pachacamac, that was one of the greatest oracles in the ancient Peru, where its buildings were means of worship to their gods. Pilgrims from all over the Inca Empire arrived walking through its long streets. In Pachacamac, the adobe structures merged with the desert sand, configuring over the centuries a sacred space where we had the opportunity to intervene with a new museum to the site. Reading the ancestral architecture that lies there was a way for us to inoculate their traces, to incorporate the dimensions and scale of their walls, or its dissonances when accommodating to the topography desert. Those readings generated new imaginaries for potentially inform our new project. This new museum is located in a limited area defined by the Ministry of Culture based on previously impacted land near the Inca temple of Acchahuasi. The building was born from the understanding of the topography, and from then, the definition of its routes, of its streets. Because as Jonna Friedman said, for us, the true prototype of a museum is a street. The building is projected from the emptiness of its paths, linked in a way to the ancestral act of pilgrimage, creating some cutouts for the different possibilities of circulation and at the same time for framing the gaze towards the pre-Hispanic temples. So the walking experience builds the museum experience, relating it permanently to the sacred surroundings, framing the buildings and the landscape. The materiality, mostly in concrete phase, dialogues with the stone that we used to contain the pre-existing gardens, reusing a material that was present in the place. The building is meant to act as a mediator with the landscape, placing the ancient temples as exterior elements of the museum, and framing the desert, bringing it closer to the building. The museum is conceived as a fragmented but unitary building that takes care of its contact with the shrine, avoiding competing with the pre-existing structures. We refrain from introducing new languages, especially for openings. The roof is perforated with different patios for light and wind circulation, allowing us to configure a silent elevation in relation to the sanctuary, to neutralize the presence of the new building in this place. In the same way, the main elevation of the building is not perceived in its real scale, as the difference in levels is used to subtly bury it, mitigating its impact on the site and configuring a blind elevation that exposes its bare material when receiving the visitors. The museum works with the topography not only at the level of its surface, but also on its roofs. Alluding the seismic territory, the roofs fold in a break that allows light to pass through. And it is in this intersection where one of the passes is generated as part of its permeable condition, folding the two exhibition rooms of the museum. The building is then a relational entity. Its surfaces folds into ramps to ensure integration and inclusion, while a great prefabricated concrete lattice configures its west elevation to contain the sun, defining the volume in its abstraction, placing one more layer of materiality in this place. To intervene in a place of that scale and magnitude requires strokes long enough to root. Therefore, the streets that shape and contain the topography are a fundamental part of the museum's journey, as it was at the time for the pilgrims of ancient Peru. Its concrete materiality allows us to eliminate the wall's thicknesses as opposed to the width of the pre-Hispanic ones. The concrete exposes the footprint of its factory in dialogue with the traces of the rammed earth ones. This austere material, with a low maintenance cost, makes it sustainable for a state building in Peru. The decision to use concrete was also made thinking about the relationship of the building with its gravity, as walls now become beams that detach from the ground, opposed to the ones in the surroundings that merge with the desert, setting it in a state of flotation, seeking not to touch the ground as a sign of respect for the shrine. and mitigating its impact, calibrating its presence. Finally, a more recent project in the mountains of Lima, a house in Cieneguilla. For this project, we recovered some readings that we made for a contest some years before, where architectural imageries aroused from Machu Picchu building. This is one of those representations, where an outline of the roofless walls appeared as a new imagery for our new project. So we reinstall it as an origin to this house. The shadow we see in the picture is in a way a reading of its own architecture. An abstract representation projected in the entrance patio emerging from its own architecture. This house is articulated actually by means of a circulation defined by its outline. By installing a concrete piece that extends and spatializes throughout the house. This walking space is the gesture of this project, which from the same section generates variations in relation to the spaces it relates to, increasing and linking their different uses, regardless of their level of privacy. The project is located in a rural area in the mountains of Lima, where the adobe rammed earth walls are present to these days. The project inserts its own wall to create intimacy and containment, as a continuity with the environment in the material filiation, in a dialogue with the constructive tradition of this place. Establishing through repetition a series of patios for the private areas of the house, placing both materialities in tension. This is a way to connect and bring both traditions into dialogue. A similar approach is taken in another scale with prefabricated adobe blocks, which are derived from those of Huacapuyana, for example, in Lima, which were manufactured on site, taking advantage of our construction tradition, and were inserted into the concrete structure to shelter the house from the cold nights. So by reading our projects, we allowed ourselves also to find our new discoveries, our own discoveries, because a project can be in turn also an abstraction, and therefore a possible collection of imageries for future projects. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for sharing your inspiring work in and on concrete. Between yesterday and just now, the range of techniques, forms, formats, and effects shows how truly versatile concrete is. But of course, given our interest in design as a cultural practice, concrete's versatility materializes important ideas about the ways we live in the world. So I want to connect to yesterday a little bit more. So as you know, I think with Chicago's concrete legacy, which is primarily modernist, is an important and under-recognized, I would say, counter-narrative to prevailing local practices at the time. But as we heard yesterday and we're seeing today, in most parts of the world, concrete is a primary means of materializing modernist ideas. And I want to elaborate on that a little bit to make those connections. So, Martin, you started with an image from Niemeyer, an image from Artigas, and Bobardi. And my understanding is that Niemeyer was representative of the Carioca school. And as you said, Artigas and maybe to a little differently. Artigas in particular was representative of the Paulista school. This was an important debate, right? They kind of happen around the same time. They're both modernists, they're both working primarily in concrete, but they have actually some very different ideas about how modernism should be, right, and be formed. Could you elaborate on a little bit on that debate?
Yeah, it's a huge debate. I
Yeah.
will try to be
I know, and I'm
brief. But yeah, the thing is that Niemeyer was the main figure and was very influential for everybody, even for Paulista school. And there's a lot of followers of Niemeyer in Rio, and also other architects that were contemporary that unfortunately didn't live that long, because Niemeyer died with 105 years old, so he produced a lot. As Alfonso Heidi, who made the MAM, the Museum of Modern Art in Rio. And actually, I don't know exactly how to place this kind of differences during the time they were happening, you know. I can talk more about our perception from today. And I think it's a different approach. They both used a lot of concrete as a main material, the fluidity of the concrete, and Niemeyer used it more in an abstract way as a formal exploration, a visual exploration, a spatial exploration. You can notice that almost all his buildings were like painted white or cladded, and the material is not exposed. So there's no material dimension, like craft dimension to it. It's more an abstract approach, and at the same time more object-like, kind of sculptural things. And the São Paulo school is different from my perspective, because they deal more with the territory, doing like big spans, like big open spaces that are covered with big concrete roofs. And then the territory comes in very, very free from that. So it's a different approach in terms of materialization also, because they were like very much wanted to show the craft and the work, the labor involved, also in more a material way of expressing the material construction of that, more like in a political way too, not ideological way too, very strongly associated how you build, and it was very connected with the means of production that we had at the time, and the development of Brazil and all the conflicts that came. So I think the Escola Paulista is more about this kind of issues than the formal exploration that Niemeyer represents. But it's my view.
That's fine. We're happy.
There are
Yeah.
others.
Well, you know, I think, so Bob talked about our campus in the framework of brutalism, and you talked about Rainer Banham's new brutalism. I sometimes hear the Paulista school referred to as brutalist, but Artigas actually rejected that term, didn't he? Because it was too European. Is that right?
Yeah, Paulo too. He didn't like the idea of, well, firstly, he didn't like the idea of Escola Paulista at all, Paulo Mendes da Rocha, okay, because he didn't believe in schools of nothing. But he was very anti-dogmatic in a way. But yeah, the brutalist thing was like kind of it's very controversial, because as Bob was saying yesterday, it came from the Smithsons with completely different thing that Banham did. And so it was a completely different discussion that doesn't apply to that view that I have with Escola Paulista, right, that was more about kind of an ethical thing that maybe the brutalists have, but I don't think as a movement. He didn't like to think as a static movement, you know, that it became at the end, I think.
Patty, you anchored your work in incredible older Peruvian cultural and material histories. I'd love to hear you also elaborate a little bit more on the key ideas and forms of Peruvian modernism. Were there shared characteristics as clear of a school as in Brazil? Or is it more so like Chicago, where it's more loosely linked? Or is it something else entirely?
Well, We have an important production of modern architecture.
Yeah.
I think from 1940 to these days, we continue to have a lot of influence of modernism, and not only in the building structures, mostly public, that were done between the 40s and the 70s maybe of last century, but also in the way that we are formed in the architecture schools. No? So all these dogmatic things that we know about modern architecture have been like very filtered in our way of learning architecture in our schools. And maybe I would dare to say that it's still going on that way, you know? So we needed to as projectists and teaching professors on the design studio, try to understand that. So in a way, we don't have, obviously, a school so well known as the Paulist school or the Porto school in Portugal, for example. But we needed to understand our affiliations. No? So that's in a way what I was trying to show today, because we are connected with what we have been inherited from architecture from our past that goes a lot further than modern architecture. So I think a way to understand that for us has been with the medium of representation. So representation for us is a medium that is open enough upon abstraction to read those values that are interesting for us, and in a way to stay apart from those dogmatic ideas that formed that architecture in that time. So we still can be learning about modern architecture, but responding in a more contemporary way, only to understand those decisions, architectonic decisions, further than the ideas behind them. No? So in a way, I think it's impossible not to refer to pre-Hispanic architecture, to colonial architecture, and modern architecture as a whole of inherited architecture that influences our work.
Yeah.
As has been mentioned a couple of times, I think like a lot of the work, especially that modernist work in Chicago and Brazil and Peru and other parts of the world, is reaching this kind of moment where its material viability and future is a question. And so this question of preservation, and like design, preservation is a reflection of values, right, of cultural value. And we could spend a semester on that. You know, one of the challenges here at UIC is that for many people, the architecture of our campus is hard to love, right? So we're constantly having to make the case and remake the case for the importance of our campus, the architectural and urban value of our campus. And, you know, I had said to you, Bob, in a kind of previous call that, like, Unity Temple would seem to be an obvious project to be preserved. It's canonical for right, you know. But you said it was actually quite a fight. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. It's not that anyone was arguing against the preservation of Unity Temple, but there's a big gap between the public saying, oh yeah, keep that, and it actually happening. The financial ends of it, the municipality support for that. And Unity Temple, I mean, we started working on it in 2000, and there's several other architectural practices in the city that had done studies before we had been there. It's been an ongoing challenge. We started doing a preservation master plan that we completed in the early 2000s and identified that Unity Temple needed about $23 million to restore it. And we didn't start real construction until 2015. And there was ongoing efforts to try to raise money through grants, funders, you name it. And it was always a small trickle of support. When it came down to someone writing a check, it's not that easy. And really the only way Unity Temple came to be was by what is referred to in that land as an angel donor. And Alphawood Foundation came in. They weren't the only donor. There was some other major significant donors, but it was Alphawood stepping up and saying, we're going to commit to this, help bring in the sort of rest of the support needed. Just real quick, you mentioned the idea of stakeholders and values. That's a relatively new concept, particularly in the historic preservation land. Previously, it's been the architect says this, and therefore that's what you do. The Getty Institute, through multiple programs, but particularly keeping it modern, the Getty Institute funds both research and planning documents. They don't fund hard construction work, really. But they've had a big initiative internationally on getting owners to approach preservation and heritage conservation projects in a way that's called a conservation management plan. And it's really identifying who are the stakeholders, and it's looking at it on both local and international levels. So the stakeholders are not just the owners, it's the users, it's the neighbors. If it's an architectural icon, it's the international community. And then going through and identifying what all of the relevant values of the property are. And there's financial values, there are architectural and history values, there's use values, there's sustainability values. And it's not just one thing. Where traditionally, preservation, this is a building by Frank Lloyd Wright, we should save it, and how do we do it? And it opens up to a much bigger conversation in a way to look at values and doing a sort of value-based decision-making process. And it doesn't really change the end results, but what it does is it makes it a more inclusive process, which makes it more engaging to a broader community.
Well, and to piggyback on that, I mean, the Gettys, the Keeping It Modern grants were foundational to the work that was done at MASP. And I'm wondering, like, you know, since concrete's not that common here and can be, as I said, hard to love, I'm wondering if concrete's ubiquity in Brazil or Peru makes some of those arguments a little, I'm going to use the word easier, but maybe that's not. Does making the case for their cultural historic value come a little more easily because concrete is more ubiquitous outside of like it really, truly remarkable, important buildings?
Yeah, we had a grant from the Getty, as we discussed. It was a great thing because they allowed to do a very extensive plan of maintenance and recuperation of the structure, because the MASP was this big beam, and it still is like 60 centimeters bent in the middle, so it's like more than 10% of almost 10%. So there are a lot of very big issues on preservation, but to answer your question, and these works have been done very successfully based on that research that was funded by Getty. But in Brazil, the concrete is very much loved as a material, and it became a trend, actually. It's like all the contemporary projects that are made are like based on concrete, and the public, it's very receptive, and it has this contemporary approach, but also it's valued as an old material too. So I think it's very different from what we were learning yesterday here.
Yeah. Well, for us, it's a little bit complicated, more complicated. I think we have like two sides of this story. We have all the architects and maybe most sensible group of people that obviously love our concrete, and it's so pertinent to use in our country and in our region for costs, for constructive tradition, for maintenance, and obviously to last the longest time possible because of our lack of infrastructure. So it makes a lot of sense, you know? But we have on another side all the oral politics that I don't know why, but they don't want to get closer and understand the idea of this material, look to other sites of the world and cover them and paint them, including some of the more important buildings that we have. So we don't have really a politics of preservation of modern architecture. We struggle a lot with that, architects. Nobody listens to us yet. And we unfortunately are losing a lot of those buildings today. So we are in that struggle. One side that preserves and try to preserve and try to manifest the value of that material and on those buildings, and the ones maybe that have the power are not in that direction, sadly.
So I want to ask a question about pedagogy and then open it up to the audience for some questions. So, Julie, so your practice in concrete, which we'll hear more about, like deeply informs the kind of framework for pedagogy, even though the pedagogy of material practice for you is across all materials. And at the point of departure is experimentation. I'm wondering what the role of history and theory might be within that. And Patty, for you, because you also teach, I imagine that the role of history is very strong in the way that you all teach material histories, and I'm curious about the role of experimentation. So maybe, Julie, you could start with the role of history in your material pedagogy, and maybe you could then talk about experimentation.
Yeah, I think for a lot of what I think across the spectrum, when we're kind of tackling these different modes of inquiry, whether it's in the first year studio, second, third, all the way to the kind of research courses, it's very much about like how we start to embrace other forms of thought beyond maybe what we traditionally think of as just a kind of historical reference, because I think that in order for us to kind of push where we can go with it, it's I would say like we're very different from our undergrad. Let's just say I'm trying to distinguish myself from that. So it's like the idea of precedent and things like that. They obviously play a role. If I'm showing I'm showing students a lot of work in the kind of areas of landscape, right? But I don't necessarily ask for them to wash, rinse, repeat, right? I want to be able to start to see other kind of forms of inspiration. So a lot of like the work comes from probably looking more at artists than anything, right? Like looking at somebody like Barry Wark's work, or looking at Tara Donovan, or somebody that's like going to be kind of inspiring. So a lot of the work that happens in that first year studio actually starts there. And then by the time, we're making our way all the way to the integrated studio, Roger's then like bringing in Nerby and others that are very much kind of rooted in a way of thinking about experimentation and prototyping and ways to like start to think about objects and artifacts and how we can start to test and test again. And I see that carry all the way from that very first studio. It's open-ended and it's not just about concrete, of course, but by the time he's able to kind of really kind of dissect, one material, the precast concrete, more deeply, that idea of precedent and kind of historical reference is still very much kind of ingrained in, I think, what he's doing in his studios too, even though it's getting to much more refined detail. But I think that's where it's like exciting that they are trying to think about ways to take other references, take something completely different that's not architectural at all necessarily, using material scientists as a means to start to interrogate the way in which we kind of approach like looking at some materials. So in my studios, even if it's totally out of the wheelhouse, and I'm even having that discussion with some of them, the ones that showed the tetrapods, they knew nothing about tetrapods. So it's like, how do you start to kind of dissect some of these things that are not necessarily in the kind of wheelhouse of architecture? Well, go to material scientists, go to who you think is going to be the most, maybe the easier way to kind of interrogate that as a system or something like that. So it's, we're not, kind of finding that like traditional historic reference, but trying to kind of find, their own path. And I think that's also good at a graduate level, that they have to find that path for themselves. So that's where a lot of the experimentation, I hope, brings them.
So in our case, we have been directing our own studio design studio for the past 5 years, and we teach mostly the last year thesis project. So they have to be complex buildings in order to graduate. So what we have been experimenting is in the way to teach, and get away from those dogmatic ways that we learned to design in our schools of architecture. So to open more uncertain spaces of reflection, to include intuition in the process. So for all of that, we have been experimenting in ways to teach, mostly. And that's where the representation part began, and it was like a retroalimentation with our studio projects also. But the idea of representation as a space, because we understood in one moment that architects or our students in Peru had a lot of difficulties to talk about a building they were interested in. They could describe it, they could install it in a frame time of history of architecture or a style maybe, but when we ask them, but why do you like it? Why do you feel or think it's interesting? They lack of abilities to understand that. So for us, a representation was a way to reveal those values in a more abstract way, and to make them in a way be aware of those findings of different buildings that we have in our country in different times. So I think for us the experimentation has been all revolving around representation. That's.
I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Yeah, 10.
You mentioned there is that one wonderful quote that the best museum is like a street. Could you elaborate on that a little bit and what that means for designing a building? Maybe that's a museum and like a street. Maybe Martin can talk about mass food, whether that might be applicable.
Yeah, it was pertinent for us because, as I mentioned, Pachacamac was the oracle, most important oracle in Peru, ancient history, and we have a very important walkways that come from the Incas that unified Argentina to Ecuador, and all the region have their pilgrims arriving to Pachacamac. So Pachacamac is a place with huge streets to receive all this pilgrimage. And it makes a lot of sense to recall that and to dialogue with that. And also it's a very important big desert. So a little piece of new architecture there of 2,000 square meters, that was the program at first we thought it will be very difficult to engage to the place, to root in the place. So the streets were for us the way to engage to that place, to filter the new pilgrimage that is tourism in the world right now. And we received, in Pachacamac, is the second tourist place in Peru after Machu Picchu. So it was, for us, make a lot of sense to establish that relationship with the museum, the site, and the temples through streets. So for us, it's more important the outside of the museum, where you can see the temples that surround us, that the museum inside, that obviously is important because we have a lot of different pieces found in the place and brought throughout all Latin America through this pilgrimage. And we show that in the inside of the museum. But for us, the museum had to be a concentration of streets to dialogue with the place.
Yeah, maybe I will answer indirectly, but MASP is a very nice museum basically because it produces this super open plaza at the level of the street. And it was the origin of the museum was a collection made by a private person, but the Lina Bobardi worked with Pietro Maria Bardi. They were a couple, and they thought the museum from this collection, but as a very cultural tool, like a formation tool to in a kind of educational process to create public to arts, and that school was very important. So this openness of the spaces, the internal spaces, but mostly this big plaza became very important part of the institution. And so the space, it's kind of the foundation of the idea of the institution, and it's very well materialized. Until nowadays, all the main protests and manifestations occurs in that space in São Paulo. It became the civic space for excellence of the city. So it's the street or the center of the public realm in São Paulo. So actually, this quote is very real in São Paulo. It happens like that.
Go to Amy and then to yes.
So I'm wondering how Patricia and Julie heard each other, because I heard similarities with the invocations of AI as a tool, as a companion, as an instrument of great flexibility, and the idea of representation as something that allows a kind of imaginary activity. But at the same time, we know that AI comes, like the machinery, like the 3D printers, like the software, comes with a very particular, derives a very particular set of commercial and even military derivations, and representation in architecture comes from a very particular set of cultural priorities, no less elite in many ways. So I'm wondering if you hear similarities and differences between how you invoke those parts of your practice and teaching.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to start to think about how, I mean, obviously I very much use representation and drawing to have the students further to kind of develop their ideas, and that's part of what we do as well. But you know, the kind of thoughts about like experimenting through the drawing and through like things like AI, which is now another just tool to us. I think that there's like a lot of, I think we're, you know, trying to use these as tools, really no different than what we've been doing in the past, and it's more about like how do you start to use that as a new language within the work, and I like how we're, you know, actually kind of seeing the kind of spectrum of just the kind of skewed. I was actually looking at yours and seeing like sometimes these oblique and seeing the black and white, and this obscurity sometimes for me was really fascinating, because it's like sometimes there's some obscurity in what you're seeing with AI. You don't really know what you're getting, because sometimes it just produces a funny result, but that's part of the process, is that you're just using that as fuel for what you're trying to do. So those moments where it's like you're not really sure what you're seeing is, I think, the exciting kind of moment, right? To be able to start to discover something through the act of doing that drawing, or doing something drawing like in AI, that there's, I can see that it all of a sudden starts to really push or challenge the way you actually originally thought about the work, and for the students anyway, that to me is the exciting part about it. Now, obviously, there's some things where it's like it's giving you information that you didn't necessarily anticipate, or it's not what you want. But But that's where you have to, especially as for my graduate students, and for us as practicing architects, it's like you have to be able to have some control over what you're after or what you want to achieve, but allowing yourself to have that open-endedness to me is where I think where something kind of, really exciting lies.
Yeah, when I was listening to your talk, I also sensed a lot of words and ideas that were very alike. So this intention or to have open endings or no ending at all, or uncertainty as a space to experiment, the process itself as the value of the project. So there's a lot of things in common, but we were not really so keen into digital technology until the pandemics, really, where we were forced to teach in our country. We didn't have classes open for 2 years almost. So those 2 years we needed to teach our students in Zoom, by Zoom. And we were experimenting a lot in the classroom before that with actual 3D models, and that was our way to experiment in the design studio. So we were forced to find a new way, and we turned into virtual modeling, simple SketchUp, but that was a way to understand a new possibility to go into representation. Because representation for architects is our language, and maybe we, in one way, we understood that the floor plans were for architects our comfort zone. When we have everything articulated in a floor plan, it's difficult for us to move something, So the first action was to postpone the floor plan in the speculation of the process, and to postpone it a lot. And that was very uncomfortable for our students. Same. Yeah. But it was a way to force them into understanding other possibilities of representation, not as the main to construction only, but as a way of explore. The first actions were in dialogue with Mata Clark, cut the model, the virtual model, and those cuttings were represented in different ways. So in some ways, in some moments, the cuttings were very abstract itself. And then we have a next step that we called decoding architecture, and those decodings were also new drawings about architectures that they were interested in. The only impossibility for them was to draw a line for themselves. Every line was from the architect that designed the project, and that was our way to approach that.
Okay, so I screwed up and let us go a little long. So what we're going to do is break for lunch. Exhibition openings out here and upstairs, which the folks will be there to answer questions. If you had questions that didn't get answered, I'm sorry, please come up and we'll have those conversations independently. We would love that. And we'll start back here at 1:30 with panel 3. Thank you very much.